For those who don't know me, it's me, your pilot. And today we're going to delve into the story of how one plane became the executioner of the German Air Force, the dreaded Luftwaffe. But to understand this, we need to go back to 1943. That year, the American 8th Air Force, the famous mighty 8th, was in trouble. Our strategic bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were flying daylight missions deep into the heart of Germany and occupied Europe. The idea was simple: use the precision of daylight to destroy the factories, refineries, and industries that fueled Hitler's war machine. The theory was good, but the reality was brutal. Our bombers were resilient, it's true, nicknamed Flying Fortresses for a reason, but they weren't invulnerable. Our fighter escorts, like the rugged and powerful P-47 Thunderbolt and the unique twin-engine P-38 Lightning, were excellent fighting machines. The problem wasn't the quality of the aircraft, but the amount of fuel they could carry. There was simply no way to protect the bombers all the way. They could only go so far, say, to the German border, and then, with empty tanks, they were forced to turn around and return to England. This point where our fighters turned was known to Luftwaffe pilots as the turning point, or more somberly, as the death zone for the bombers. It was at this point that the German pilots, who until then had been lying in wait, sprang into action en masse. Massive formations of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, often impeccably coordinated by radio, mercilessly attacked the B-17 and B-24 formations, which suddenly found themselves alone. Bombers fell from the sky by the dozens. Losses were unbearable. Pilots and crews were being decimated. Morale was low. We had technology. We had courage. But we lacked the only thing that truly mattered for mission survival escort range. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, laughed at our inability to go all the way. They boasted that no Allied plane could penetrate and return unscathed from the heart of the Reich. But this disdain was about to cost them the war. To understand how we arrived at the legendary P-51, we must revisit its origins, which were, to say the least, unusual. The Mustang's story didn't begin with Americans asking for a revolutionary fighter. In fact, it began with the British. In 1940, the British government, desperate for aircraft after the Battle of Britain, approached North American aviation in the United States. They wanted the company to license produce the Curtiss P-40 fighter. But North America's president, James Howard Dutch Kindleberger, had another idea. He told the British, "We can build a better plane than the P-40. Give us some time and money." The British agreed on the condition that the new fighter be ready in record time. And North American delivered. In just 102 days, the prototype was ready. The aerodynamic design was radically new, especially the laminar-swept wings, which allowed for faster and more efficient flight. The plane was beautiful, elegant, and, at first glance, showed great promise. However, the first versions of the P-51, the models called Mustang MKY for the British and P-51 and A-36 for the Americans, came equipped with the engine Allison V1710. This engine was robust and reliable, but it had a critical flaw in our context. It was optimized for low altitude. At low altitudes, it was a marvel, fast and agile, excellent for reconnaissance or ground attack missions. But when we climbed to the cruising altitude of bombers, which was where the Luftwaffe attacked, between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, the Allison engine simply ran out of steam. Performance dropped dramatically, making the Mustang inferior to the German Bf-109 and FW-190, equipped with more effectively supercharged engines. That's why, when Luftwaffe pilots encountered the first Mustangs in combat over France, or even on a few sorties, they weren't intimidated. They knew the plane's limitations. They knew that at high altitudes, they could easily outperform it. They saw the Mustang as a competent fighter, perhaps, but not as the strategic threat the 8th Air Force desperately needed. The P-51 was still a joke to the German aces, an Allied miscalculation they exploited mercilessly. They didn't imagine that the solution to their biggest problem lay not in a new aircraft design, but in a simple and brilliant engine swap. This swap would transform a mediocre machine at altitude into a legend that would cut their formations to shreds. Salvation for the P-51, and by extension for all Allied bomber crews in Europe, came from an unusual and, at first, unofficial marriage between an American aircraft and a British engine. The idea was born not in North Americans' design offices, but in the hangars of Rolls-Royce in Great Britain. British engineers were already familiar with the Mustang's aerodynamic design excellence. They had flown it and knew it was formidable at low altitudes. They also had extensive experience with their own engine, the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, the beating heart of the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters that won the Battle of Britain. The key to the Merlin was its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Unlike the Allison V1710, the Merlin was designed to operate efficiently and at full power at the high altitudes where escort combat took place. In a risky move, the British took some of the first Allison-powered Mustangs, the A and B models, and experimentally installed the Merlin. The results were immediate and spectacular. What had previously been a competent but limited fighter became a high-altitude combat machine capable of rivaling and, in many respects, surpassing the Luftwaffe's best fighters on its own terms. The Merlin-powered Mustang combined North Americans' cutting-edge aerodynamics with the high-altitude power of the British engine. It became the P-51 Binauer designation, and the world of aerial combat would never be the same when the United States Air Force, USAF, saw the results of this perfect marriage. Production of the P-51B, with the American version of the Merlin engine manufactured under license by Packard, skyrocketed. Suddenly we had a fighter that could not only reach the deepest targets in Germany, but also go toe-to-toe, if not better, with anything the Germans could put in the air. In December 1943, the first P-51Bs began flying escort missions from England. Luftwaffe pilots, who had learned to scoff at the first version of the Mustang, were in for a very unpleasant surprise. They laughed at the Allison Mustang, but the Merlin Mustang was another story. The arrival of the Merlin-powered P-51BC marked the end of innocence for the Luftwaffe. However, the aircraft alone was not enough. The 8th Air Force's mindset and combat doctrine needed to change, and this change came at the hands of a man who knew that to win in the air, one had to be aggressive. Initially, P-51 squadrons, like their predecessors, were under strict orders to remain in tight formation with the bombers. The mission was passive escort, protecting the big friends, the affectionate nickname for the bombers, from direct attacks and remaining close to them like a shadow. This tactic, however, was limiting. It allowed the German fighters to avoid combat, regroup, and attack at a more opportune moment, or against more vulnerable formations. The Luftwaffe still held the initiative. It was the General Jimmy Doolittle, an American hero famous for the Tokyo raid, who took command of the 8th Air Force and enacted the most important doctrinal shift in air warfare in Europe. Doolittle realized that the Mustang had the performance and range to do more than just protect. It had the potential to destroy the Luftwaffe on its own territory. The new order, radical for the time, was clear. Hunt the German fighters wherever you find them. Passive escort has been replaced by aggressive hunting. The Mustang pilots were freed to leave the bombers if necessary and pursue the bandits, the code name for the enemies, to their airfields and air bases. The P-51 was no longer a babysitter. It was a long-range predator. This shift in doctrine was what truly transformed the Mustang's impact. Instead of waiting for the Luftwaffe to come to us, we went to them. And as the German fighters prepared to form up and attack the bombers, they were surprised by squadrons of P-51s that appeared out of nowhere, dropping in from high altitude, tearing their formations apart before they could even begin their coordinated attacks. From that moment on, the Luftwaffe stopped being the hunter and became the prey. Doolittle's new aggressive doctrine and the mass arrival of Merlin-powered P-51s culminated in a massive offensive that became known in history as the Big Week, or officially, the Operation Argument. This event, which occurred in February 1944, was the true turning point in the air war over Europe. By then, the 8th Air Force was on the verge of collapse, with bomber losses approaching 20% on some missions, such as the disastrous second raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943. If losses continued at this rate, we would have to cease daylight bombing and admit defeat in the air. Big Week was our desperate and calculated response. The objective of Big Week was audacious: to attack German fighter aircraft factories relentlessly for 7 days. The logic was that by attacking the production facilities, we would force the Luftwaffe to defend itself with everything it had. It was a trap, but not for the bombers. It was a trap for the German fighters. Between February 20th and 25, 1944, hundreds of bombers, escorted by a growing number of P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s, with the Mustang leading the pack in range, flew deep into German territory. And it was there that the Luftwaffe encountered its final surprise. German fighters, still in large numbers, scrambled to defend their factories. They expected to face bombers with limited escort. Instead, they faced a wall of combat-hungry Mustangs that would never turn. The Mustangs, free to hunt, intercepted the German fighter formations before they could even approach the bombers. The result was devastating. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost about 17% of its fighter pilots trained for the defense of the Reich, a loss of personnel, unrecoverable, Snippet 110. It wasn't just the destroyed factories that ruined the Luftwaffe. It was the loss of hundreds of their most valuable veterans, shot down by the Mustangs they initially despised. From that moment on, Allied air superiority was assured, and the Luftwaffe's arrogance turned to despair. Many people think that the phenomenal range of the P-51, which allowed the Allies to win the air war, was due solely to the addition of external fuel tanks, the famous ejection tanks, or drop tanks. While these tanks were vital in extending combat range, the Mustang's true magic lay in its original aerodynamic design, which made it incredibly efficient compared to its contemporaries. The secret lay primarily in two innovations that North American implemented in the Mustang's design. The first was the use of wings with laminar flow profile. Simply put, the wing shape was designed to slow the transition of airflow from laminar, smooth, to turbulent, dragging over a larger area of the wing's surface. While in practice under real combat conditions, this characteristic did not achieve theoretical perfection. It still significantly reduced drag at cruising and high-speed speeds. The Mustang, therefore, glided through the air much more efficiently than fighters like the P-47 or the FW-190. Less drag means less power required to maintain a given speed, and crucially, this translates into greater range with the same amount of fuel. The second innovation, and perhaps the most intriguing, was the cooling system design. The P-51 used a liquid-cooled Merlin engine, which required a large radiator. In older aircraft, the radiator was a significant source of drag. In the Mustang, the radiator was cleverly positioned mid-fuselage, with an air intake under the belly. The incoming airflow to cool the engine was carefully channeled and accelerated through a duct before being exhausted at the rear, generating a small forward thrust. A phenomenon known as Meredith effect. It was a primitive form of jet propulsion. This thrust was small, but at high speeds, it offset the drag generated by the radiator. In practical terms, the Mustang was using the engine's waste heat to help propel itself, further improving its efficiency and contributing immensely to it being the only fighter capable of covering the entirety of the deepest bombing missions. It was a plane ahead of its time, and the Luftwaffe had nothing that could match its long-range efficiency. Even after the P-51B's success during Big Week, Allied engineers knew there was room for improvement. The P-51B still had one notable shortcoming that needed to be addressed: pilot visibility. The B and C models used a bird cage canopy, often complemented by a more streamlined rear section, but this blocked rear vision. In aerial combat, especially in a theater as crowded as the skies over Europe, vision is survival. A pilot who can't see an enemy approaching from behind is an easy target. Luftwaffe asses, like Erich Hartmann, were masters at sneaking up on them. The solution came with the model that would become the most famous and produced of all, the P-51D. The main distinguishing feature of the P-51D was the introduction of the canopy shaped like a bubble canopy. This canopy, made of molded perspex, a durable transparent plastic, completely eliminated the metal structure behind the pilot, giving him a nearly unobstructed 360-degree view. The bubble canopy was a game changer. Suddenly, Mustang pilots could maintain much better surveillance and prevent German fighters from launching surprise attacks. Improved visibility had a profound effect on our pilots' confidence and lethality. They could track the Luftwaffe more effectively, both at high altitudes and during low-altitude pursuits. Furthermore, the P-51D came with another vital armament improvement, increased 4 to 6 50-caliber 12.7mm machine guns, all fed by a simplified ammunition system that reduced jams. More bullets and greater accuracy meant a greater chance of downing a German fighter with a single short burst. The P-51D with the bubble canopy and the 650 Calzit wasn't just a fighter. It was the definitive air superiority fighter of World War II. It combined the Merlin's high-altitude performance, the range of its efficient airframe, and now the visibility and firepower needed to completely dominate the skies, transforming what had once been a sneer on the faces of German pilots into a look of terror. The P-51's superiority in the European theater was not achieved simply by shooting down German fighters attacking the bombers. It was consolidated by the systemic destruction of the Luftwaffe's ability to regenerate. This was directly due to the aggressive tactics of re-hunting that the Mustangs could execute thanks to their long range. Once the Mustangs established altitude supremacy and protected the bombers, they did not immediately return home. They were free to drop to tree line and actively pursue any target of opportunity. This tactical hunting, or strafe, had a catastrophic cascading effect on the Luftwaffe's organization. Mustang pilots furiously attacked airfields, fuel depots, trains, and, crucially, draining schools and transport aircraft. Germans. Imagine the scene: a young German pilot, with only a few dozen flight hours under his belt, barely mastering basic maneuvers, is on a training mission or in a slow-moving liaison aircraft. And suddenly a P-51D appears, tearing through the sky. The chance of survival is slim. Luftwaffe veterans had been killed in Big Week and subsequent battles. The replacement generation was poorly trained, inexperienced, and unprepared for the stress of combat with elite fighters like the Mustang. By attacking bases and schools, the Allies ensured that flow of replacement experienced pilots dried up completely. The famous American ace, Robert S. Johnson, reported that Mustangs had the long-range advantage to hit even training schools, picking off young men who were just learning to fly. In essence, the Luftwaffe could have continued producing FW-190s and Bf-109s, but these planes were either grounded for lack of fuel due to strategic bombing, which we'll cover later, or flown by inexperienced young men who were easy prey for the Allied veterans. The Mustang not only defeated the Luftwaffe in the present, it ensured its future. It was a brilliant and ruthless strategy that sealed the fate of Hitler's Air Force. Aerial warfare is not just a fight of machines. It is fundamentally a fight of men. And the P-51 Mustang was responsible for eliminating the backbone of the Luftwaffe, its fighter aces, the so-called experts. The German pilots who had fought since the Battle of Britain were incredibly skilled and had amassed an impressive number of victories. Many were top-notch aces with over 100 kills. However, unlike us, The Allies, who frequently rotated our pilots home after a set number of missions to rest and train the rookies. The Germans kept their aces in continuous combat until they were killed or wounded. This made them lethal specialists, but it also made them finite and irreplaceable resources. The introduction of the long-range Mustang, operating under the aggressive fighter doctrine, forced these experts fighting constantly and in places that had previously been sanctuaries. There was no longer the security of knowing that the Allied escort would turn. Suddenly, the German aces were engaged in life-or-death combat in depth over Germany, often vastly outnumbered. The P-51 was the perfect aircraft to face the German fighters. Although the Bf-109 and FW-190 were excellent in their specialties, the 109 in climb, the 190 in dive and roll, the Mustang was a perfect compromise machine, outperforming German fighters at altitude, where most combat took place, and at dive speed. In a prolonged combat with a competent Allied pilot, the Mustang offered the greatest margin for error. As the war progressed in 1944, Luftwaffe aces began to fall at alarming rates, many of them shot down by young Mustang pilots who had the advantage of superior aircraft and more intelligent mission planning. With each German ace downed, we lost not just a plane, but decades of combat experience. The German formations, once disciplined and led by veterans, became disorganized and tactically naive, making it easier for the Mustangs to cut them to pieces. The P-51 had turned the individual quality of the German pilot into a strategic liability. It wasn't just the aircraft itself that was superior, but the aerial combat tactics our Mustang pilots perfected. The P-51, especially the D model, was an incredibly stable platform at high speeds and altitudes, allowing our pilots to employ tactics that capitalized on the power of the Merlin engine and the aerodynamics of the laminar flow wings. German fighters, such as the Bf-109, were generally excellent at tight turns, especially at low altitudes, and had a high rate of climb. To counter these forces, Mustang pilots rarely engaged in horizontal turning combat, turn fight, prolonged at lower altitudes unless they were at an extreme advantage. Instead, the main tactic was the energy attack. At high altitudes, the favorite tactic was boom and zoom, attack and climb. The Mustangs flew much higher than the bombers and often above the German fighter formations. When a target was sighted, the P-51 pilot would dive hard, the boom, reaching dizzying speeds, fired its 650 machine guns, and then used the energy gained in the dive to rise back up, the zoom, for the safety of higher altitude. Out of the effective range of German guns and machine guns, the Mustang was renowned for its stability and structural strength in steep, high-speed dives, surpassing the limitations of some of its German rivals. Another crucial tactic was the high-speed yo-yo. If a German fighter attempted a turning maneuver to escape, the Mustang, with its superior speed, did not need to enter the tight turn. Instead, the pilot made a zoom up and out of the flight plan, the first part of the yo-yo, losing speed but maintaining positional energy, altitude. This allowed him to cut off the enemy's turning circle and return to the overhead attack, conserving the Mustang's energy. In short, our pilots used the P-51 as a high-energy fighter, avoiding the low-speed close-quarters combat preferred by inexperienced pilots. They attacked with speed and altitude, dismantling German formations in a flurry of energy and fire. This tactical superiority was the perfect complement to the machine's power and was what allowed them to be so devastating. There is a classic debate in the history of World War II fighter aviation. American armament based on the heavy machine gun caliber 50, 12,7 meters Browning, against the German guns of 20 mm 30 mm at first glance. The German cannon appears superior. A 20 mm or 30 mm shell carries an explosive charge and causes immediate and massive damage, often capable of downing an enemy fighter with a single well-placed hit. And the P-51s, especially the D, carried 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. The difference, however, lay in threat of fire, reliability and volume. The 50 Browning machine guns, particularly the NM2 installed in the Mustang, were notably reliable at high altitudes, where cold and pressure could cause jamming problems in larger caliber weapons. They also had a rate of fire significantly higher, about 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun. By firing all 6 machine guns together, the Mustang Pilot could unleash a soar of steel and fire at the target. The total volume of rounds fired in a short burst was far greater than what German fighters could unleash with their synchronized cannons and machine guns. Additionally, the Americans had specialized ammunition for the 50 caliber, such as the armor-piercing incendiary API ammunition. 150 API round not only pierced the lighter armor of a German fighter, but also carried an incendiary agent. The Mustang Pilot's goal wasn't to blow a large hole in the enemy plane, but to hit vital points like the engine fuel tank, especially if they were self-sealing tanks, or cockpit, causing devastating fires. Once the fire caught in a German fighter, it was usually fatal. Although the German cannon shell was more powerful per hit, the P-51's ability to deliver an overwhelming number of highly effective shells, reliably and with greater accuracy due to the absence of excessive recoil, meant our pilots had a greater chance of achieving that killer hit in a short, high-speed engagement. The philosophy was less damage per round, but many more rounds per second. This was a key factor in our superiority. With the P-51 dominating the skies in 1944, the Luftwaffe was forced to resort to desperate measures, many of which reflected its inability to counter the Mustang in terms of speed and high-altitude range. Two of the most notable German responses were the development of heavily armored fighters and, toward the end of the war, the introduction of jet aircraft. The first response was the point defense fighter, the Focke-Wulf FW-190A8 and their heavily armored variants. To deal with the bomber carnage, the Luftwaffe began equipping their FW-190s with thicker armor around the engine and cockpit, and increased their armament with 30mm cannons, turning them into true bomber destroyers. The idea was that they could absorb the bomber's .50 caliber machine gun fire and then close in to fire their high explosive cannons. The problem: this extra weight made the FW-190 slower, less maneuverable, and therefore easier prey for the Mustang, which was too fast for them. The Mustangs loved to intercept these slow, heavy FW-190s before they reached the bombers. The second and more threatening response was the fighter jet Messerschmitt Me-262. The Me-262 was a giant technological leap, capable of flying up to 100 mph faster than the Mustang. For a brief period, it seemed the Luftwaffe had the perfect counterattack. However, the Mustang proved adaptable even against this futuristic threat. P-51 pilots soon learned that while the Me-262 was unbeatable in speed, it was extremely vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when it was at low speed and could not use its superior acceleration to escape. Our Mustang squadrons were frequently assigned to patrol German jet airfields. Many Me-262s were destroyed on the landing circuit or on the ground, targeted by accurate 50 caliber fire. The Mustang, a design born of necessity in 1940, managed to neutralize the threat of German jet technology, at least strategically. Until the end of the war, the P-51 Mustang's impact on aerial warfare went far beyond kill statistics and factory destruction. It had a profound and crippling effect on psychology of the pilots and commanders of the Luftwaffe. Before the arrival of the long-range Mustang, the German pilot had an expectation of safety. He knew that even if the bombers arrived, at some point the escort fighters would have to leave. The heart of Germany was a sanctuary. That changed completely with the aggressive fighter doctrine and the unlimited range of the P-51. The Mustangs took away from the German pilots the psychological comfort of their home field advantage suddenly. They knew they could be intercepted hundreds of miles from home, or worse, shot down while refueling at their own airfield. As I mentioned in Part 8, this constant uncertainty, the ever-present presence of the Mustang, drastically increased combat stress and fatigue. Luftwaffe commanders, like Goering, were increasingly desperate. The inability to protect the airspace of the Reichelt to irrational orders, such as that pilots must attack bombers at all costs, or the punishment of pilots who retreated from stronger Mustang squadrons. This led younger pilots to recklessly engage in combat, resulting in even greater losses for the Luftwaffe. In 1944, the mere sight of a group of P-51s, the infamous yellow noses, red noses, or checkered noses, was enough to cause many German formations to abort their missions or avoid combat. The Luftwaffe's confidence in its air superiority, crucial to morale, was completely shattered. The Mustang became the symbol of our inevitability in the air, transforming the skies of Germany, once our turning point, into the new Valley of the Shadow of Death for the Germans. The strategic role of the P-51 Mustang cannot be underestimated. It not only saved bomber crews, but also paved the way for the invasion of Europe. Recall the objective of the combined bomber. Offensive, to cripple Germany's industrial and military capabilities in order to weaken its defenses before a ground invasion. By late 1943, this offensive was failing due to unsustainable losses. Without Allied air superiority, D-Day, the Normandy landings, would have been nearly impossible. The Army and Navy depended on the certainty that the Luftwaffe could not interfere with their operations. The Mustang provided that certainty. After Big Week and the relentless hunt that followed throughout 1944, the Luftwaffe was, for all practical purposes, defeated as a strategic fighting force. The systematic destruction of their pilots and planes, combined with the successful bombing of the synthetic fuel plants, meant that by the spring of 1944, the German Air Force no longer had the capacity to mount a coordinated, large-scale attack. When D-Day finally arrived on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe's absence from the Normandy beaches was notable. There were virtually no German interceptions of the thousands of Allied support aircraft covering the landing troops. Those few German fighters that dared to appear were quickly dispatched by the fleet of Mustangs and other fighters that patrolled tirelessly. The P-51 ensured the total air supremacy. This allowed our bombers and fighter bombers to operate at will, destroying bridges, railways, and German tank columns heading for the front. Without the Mustang to clear the way and eliminate the aerial threat, the logistics and tactics of D-Day would not have worked. The P-51 was the catalyst that transformed the imminent disaster of 1943 into the decisive aerial victory of 1944, while the Mustang's legend is most firmly established over the grey skies of Europe. Its unparalleled range also made it a crucial player in the Pacific theater of operations, albeit later and in a slightly different role. In the Pacific, the main enemy was not the massive formations of fighters, but rather the vast distances that separated Allied air bases from Japanese targets. The B-29 Super Fortress heavy bombers, which were the primary bombing vehicle for Japan from mid-1944 onward, required escort. However, their bases in the Mariana Islands, such as Saipan and Tinian, were long flight times from Tokyo. Initially, the P-38 and P-47 fighters struggled to cover the entire route. It was the P-51, with its extended range and the ability to use even larger drop tanks, that solved this logistical problem. The turning point came with the conquest of It Jimain early 1945. Once the island was partially secured, airstrips were quickly built and extended. Iwo Jima lay halfway between the Marianas and Japan. With P-51s based at Iwo Jima, B-29 escort was guaranteed for the entire round trip to Japan. The arrival of the long-range Mustangs over Japan finally ended the relative impunity enjoyed by Japanese fighters like the Zero and Hayabusa. The P-51 outperformed most Japanese fighters in speed and altitude, and its pilots were generally more experienced. Although the Luftwaffe was closer to its end in 1945, the Mustang was the fighter that brought the war directly to Japanese territory, ensuring that strategic bombing could be completed without the threat of coordinated Japanese interception. It proved to be the only piston-engine aircraft in the world capable of dominating aerial combat in the two largest and most distant theaters of war. And so, we come to the end of our journey. The North American P-51 Mustang was not just a fighter. It was the weapon that changed the outcome of aerial warfare. No other piston-engine aircraft managed to combine superior aerodynamic design, a high-powered engine, courtesy of the Merlin, and most importantly, the range that made it the equalizer, the leveler, strategic of Europe. The Luftwaffe laughed at the Allison-powered Mustang, but the Merlin-powered P-51 and the 650 Calzit stopped them laughing, ensuring that the cost of sending fighters into the sky was certain destruction. It saved thousands of bomber crews' lives and ensured that D-Day took place under blue, Allied skies. It was the fighter of choice for the 8th Air Force's greatest aces, and it remains a living legend to this day. For me, as a pilot, looking at a P-51 is like seeing the embodiment of hope, innovation, and courage. It's the fighter that made a difference when we needed it most. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what made the Mustang king of the skies, know that this is just one of many incredible stories we have to tell. If you felt like you were in the cockpit with me today, crushing the Luftwaffe formations, show your support for our work. Leave your I liked in this video so YouTube understands that you love aviation history. Subscribe on the WW2 Pilots channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our in-depth analyses. And in our next video, we'll leave the skies for a while to explore the brutal and crucial life on the ground. We'll delve into the history of war supplies, exploring the logistics of survival, farms, ranches, and how American food helped win World War II. It's a story of sacrifice, mass production, and how the ranch became a front line. Don't miss it. See you in the next video.